Yeah, thank you to both of our speakers. I think you've both given very open and candid views of what you're doing with research, which I think is really within the collegiate nature of SSP and probably very helpful. And yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions. One there. It's you, Doug, yeah.
The online communities, I'm not completely clear I follow this. Do you organize these around specific research topics, or do they survive for months at a time and you use them for multiple projects over a period of time?
We use them for multiple projects over a period of time.
And then how do you incentivize people what incentivizes them to be part of this, to keep contributing to you?
So we have a whole incentive system in place. So on a monthly basis, depending on how much they participate, they will get Amazon vouchers as a reward. It's around about $20. Amazon, yeah. Incentives is always a tricky thing, but you need to do this for an online community.
I wonder if any of you can share any advice on when you do surveys, on what percentage you need as a statistically significant, meaningful break to answer, whether it should be a percentage of the community if you define that. Is that understanding, if you send out 10,000 you get 100 back, is that meaningful?
Yeah, I didn't really talk about sampling as much as I meant to, actually. I think it's partly about the numbers and it's partly about the balance. So, for example, if you've got lots of different types of users and you are doing the research across all of them, then you need to monitor that the sample is representative across different types of users, for starters, and that might be different career levels or different disciplines if you're a multidiscipline publisher. And there's kind of two ways to do that, really. One is to control the communications, the distribution of the research at the beginning, so that you're inviting a select group of participants and the numbers are balanced that way. Or you can monitor, so if it's a focus group, you can keep track of who's replying and make sure that you're inviting additional people to keep the balance. Or if it's a survey, make sure that you're capturing demographic data. That's another point, actually, that I didn't get into in terms of ordering your questions, but always put the demographic questions at the end, because otherwise people will answer those up front, get bored and not answer the really critical things that you want to ask them. So the demographic data are nice to have, but if you can capture it, then you can be monitoring while the survey is open the extent, the balance of the respondents. So that's about the kind of the spread of the sample. And then in terms of what's a valid sample numerically, it depends, as you say, on the size of your audience. I mean, I would typically hope to hear from something like 30 to 40% of an audience before I'd feel really confident that I could extrapolate from that to the bigger picture. I don't know if you guys have specific numbers that you aim for.
I would say 30-40% would be really high. I'd be very surprised if you got as high as that if you did an online survey. So the critical factor is the engagement level, and in market research generally, if you did a consumer survey, we're not in the consumer business, but if you did, you'd be looking at around about 0.5% response rate. I mean, we do get around 30 to 40% response rates to some of our studies. That's unusual. For the kind of more general surveys that you might go out into the market to just elicit opinion, you're probably looking at 10 to 20%, maybe 5%, and that would be 5% wouldn't be unusual. You don't have to be practical. There's always a kind of practical level here. So there's the volume issue, and then there's the representative nature of the sample. So there's things that you can do to make sure it's representative, as Charlie's mentioned. You can then take the data at the end and weight it to make sure. So if you need to get 25% from the US and you only get 10%, then you have to weight the sample responses up to make sure it's representative. From a number point of view, you can go as low as 30 people responding to a study, but your margin of error is pretty big. So you've got two things you can play with. You can play with the confidence level. So do you want to, in research, generally 95% confidence levels is the standard. But, you know, for practical reasons, you might choose to reduce it down to 90%, or if you really wanted to, 80%. So what that means is that, you know, if you reduce the confidence level down lower, the margin of error actually shrinks. Okay, so you're playing two things off one another. So it's about representativeness of the sample, and I think if you have to make a judgment on that, I would argue, and be practical about it. And if you've got numbers, 30 statistically is the golden standard. You don't want to go any lower than 30. You have to use lots of other different statistical techniques if you do. But if you want to get a relatively low margin of error, say 4 or 5%, 300-400 responses is what you need to the study, and then work on the representativeness post hoc. So figure out what the audience is. If you can't control for it up front in terms of like who you're marketing to or who you're sending the survey to, that's the only other way you can do it.
Wow. Let's take.
I have a question for an open question that you can. What have been the major roadblocks for you doing market research? What are the difficult difficulties?
Do you want to start with that one? That was about the roadblocks and the difficulties to undertaking research.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of the main points there. Well, so I guess to have an in-depth understanding of what you're trying to achieve. So if you're working with someone internally to really understand what is their expectation at the end of it, and sometimes the people that you're doing the work for might not necessarily be able to articulate that very well. So to have that, I think Charlie mentioned about having clear objectives up front. So, and that's clearly the case with anything you do. But that's really important. You need to understand where you want to get to with it. So I would say spending a lot of time up front there to try and tease out what is it they're really wanting to find out. That would be my main point, I think.
Yeah, it's scope creep is one of the biggest problems, isn't it? Is that you start off wanting to find one thing out, and then the more you find out, the more everybody says, oh, well, what about this and what about that? And trying to remain really focused is always a challenge.
In addition to those two things, the other thing I would say is money is the biggest obstacle, getting the business to agree to spend it. If you don't have a DIY approach, you have to buy the sample, or you need to recruit an agency. That's often the biggest roadblock. But also, in many ways, it's a good way of sorting the important projects from the not so important projects. So if your business colleagues or you yourself can't get the funding to do the research, it probably suggests that it's not as important to the business as you think it is. But that's the other roadblock is funding if you have to go to do external research.
Okay, so two questions there. One was about how you measure the life cycle of a scientific discipline to know when it's appropriate to launch a new journal, when it's going to give you a return on the investment there. And the other is how you apply market research to existing journals. No, so only for the volume, not for the translation.
I'll take the first one, Charlie. So it's a very interesting question, isn't it? So if you're launching a new journal, what's going to happen in 20 years? Say. So the kind of clues I'd give as an answer there would be to make sure you've got some trend data. So I wouldn't want to just say a particular area of chemistry is X number of articles last year. I'd want to know how many articles it was for the 5 years preceding that, and the actual growth rate. I'd want some other data on there. I'd want to find out some funding data from well-known science funding bodies. If I could actually tease out if that actually mapped onto, say, growth in published papers in the area. So that's the way I'd tackle it. So clearly we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know where it's going to go, but to use trend information based on a particular area, so a subset of chemistry, for example, I could pull out how many articles that is now, and how many it was 5 years ago, that'll actually tell me something about where it might go. That's really the only way of doing it. That would be my recommendation for that particular.
I think to answer the second question, which is about editorially, whether you're going in the right direction, if I understood, in the existing journal, it's always tricky, that one, and it's a combination of different approaches. Using secondary data, we often use citation information to understand whether the profile of the kind of people in a given subject matches what we think the journal is in terms of the aims and scope. We do it through readership surveys to make sure that the customers, the people who are reading the journal, have the right topics in that particular journal. And we also when we look at feedback from our authors as well, we look at where they also publish and what other journals they also publish in, and see if there's a match so that they are in a particular content area that we think is relevant. Is that still true compared to maybe 3 or 4 years ago? We ask them what other journals they publish in our studies. And that's another mechanism for making sure it's on track. But getting the aims and scope right is always difficult on a journal. There's probably 2 or 3 different techniques that you can use.
There was another one, was it? Follow-up from Doug, I think, was it?
Well, it's not a follow-up, but Charlie, you work for multiple clients, and I'm wondering, do you ever do client focus groups where the participants don't actually know who you represent? And if so, what are the reasons you would or wouldn't make it anonymous?
So it's a question about whether you'd ever do a blind focus group where the participants don't know who the publisher or journal is. And I have done that, and I don't like doing it, to be honest, not least because it's really hard for me to keep remembering not to say anything that gives it away. I don't think there's a massive advantage to it. I haven't noticed a huge difference between blind focus groups and non-blind focus groups in terms of the nature of the response. I think the key difference actually is whether or not representatives of the publisher or journal are in the room. So it's not whether or not the audience knows who they are, it's whether they're actually there. And people will be more candid and more prepared to say what they think are negative things, because people just have the good manners and don't want to say it in front of the publisher. So that's more where I see a distinction. But I think we've been asked to do it where the publisher feels that there might be a negative issue that people wouldn't say, even if they know, even if the publisher's not there, if they know that the group is sponsored by that publisher, they might not raise it. But the difficulty with a blind focus group is that it's very difficult to answer a very specific research objective because you've got to drive them down a route that they're not allowed to see, if you see what I mean. You're trying not to tell them that it's about a particular journal, and yet you want to find out an answer in relation to a particular journal. So I don't think it's that helpful a way of doing things. I think you have to allow for the limitations of the form. Dan.
Yeah, just a quick question for Adrian. As well as the closed communities, do you do kind of open communities? Do you see that having those type of sort of blogging platforms for authors to build their profile? Would that have a different value from a research perspective?
The two, I would imagine, would work quite closely side by side with the Mendeley platform in terms of the direction that we'll probably be taking it. Would service that need. But this is, the Mendeley platform is pretty much about the dialogue between researchers. This is also about dialogue between researchers, but also the dialogue between us and the researchers too, and asking questions and getting kind of answers that we need to make the right decisions. So that would be that they would complement that. To be the answer.
Yes, sure.
We'll get all the slides up. I think they will end up on the SSP website anyway.
And then another question for Andrew.
Yeah.
How do you incentivize
It's an interesting question because listening to Charlie and Adrian, the kind of things that have been actually offered, like Amazon vouchers, we're not actually doing any of that at the moment, which is kind of an interesting sense check for me coming here. I think we're planning to ramp up the kind of activity we're doing here, and I think that's going to be a key thing to take away for me from the session. I think as an organisation we're extremely lucky because we have a wealth of contacts and community, and the people that we have as our community are really engaged with us. They're amongst the top people in their field, etc., and they're global. And we actually, with our brand, we're actually really able to really use that very strongly. People do like to give their opinions to us. They do recognise us as a quality publisher and a great organisation. And I guess at times we probably overuse that, but I think we do need to be thinking about some of the incentives. So, in answer, no, we're not doing any at the moment, but I think we should.
I think just to kind of add to that, in terms of what you might do, you can leverage your brand if you have a good brand. If you don't, you're in that fortunate position where your brand is not that well known. And when we do research for particular journals, the Elsevier name's not there perhaps sometimes. What we find works quite well is charity donations. You make a charity donation on behalf of the respondent, and that works pretty well. And especially in the US, it works well because of all the kind of government constraints on employees that work for the government not being able to take gifts, basically. So it's a way around that.
Do they get to select the charity?
Yes, we give them 5 charities to choose from. So it is. And it depends on the nature of the group that you're interacting with. Some ways you just can't get away with having to pay them a lot. So if you're doing work with doctors, it's not unheard of to have to pay them $500 to get them to enter the focus group.
Any further questions?
I think they want their lunch.
Yeah,
Rightly
quite right
so.
too. Yeah, thank you very much for staying as long as you did.